My name's Ben Bryan. Today we're going to talk a little bit about relatively new, passed at the end of 2016, Colorado law about physician-assisted suicide. So we're going to hear a little bit about what the law is, and then we're going to hear some different perspectives on whether people should take advantage of that law to end their life, whether that's something that's morally acceptable. It's legally allowed, so then the question is it morally allowed? So today we've got with us Craig Konnoth from the law school here. He's going to tell us a little bit about what the law is, and then we've got Martin Gunderson and Christopher Tollefsen who are going to make some arguments for and against taking advantage of the law in Colorado to change your life. So we'll jump right in with Craig.
All right, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the Colorado End-of-Life Options Act, as it's called. But first, I'll just introduce, my name's Craig Konnoth. I'm a professor at the law school down the way, and I teach health law and bioethics and sexuality in the law there. So the story really begins, say 20 years ago. Well, it begins before that, but the recent story begins about 20 years ago, when the Supreme Court heard a challenge to Washington's assisted suicide law. Washington basically prohibited and criminalized, in fact, the promotion of suicide attempts by those who, quote, knowingly cause and aid another person to attempt suicide. So it went up to the U.S. Supreme Court on the theory that assisted suicide is actually a constitutional right. And the U.S. Supreme Court said, no, that is not the case. That same year, Oregon legalized an assisted suicide law that in substantive terms is quite similar to the law we have, and I'll talk about that as we go forward. The overall layout of the land is that religious groups oppose assisted suicide laws and opposed it in Oregon and in other states since then, including Colorado. The American Medical Association opposes it, and disability organizations oppose these kinds of laws. They argue that there's a certain fear of stigma and the burdens of disability that individuals might experience upon a diagnosis will drive their decision. Though a 2007 study suggests that those who are disabled would not actually choose assisted suicide to a greater degree than others. So turning to the history in Colorado itself. So in Colorado, the End-of-Life Options Act came about as the result of a popular referendum. Before that, a couple of attempts were made to pass the law through legislative means, and they failed. So in 2015, two Democrats in the House introduced the law, and it was heard and voted down in committee itself. In 2016, they introduced it again. And this time, it was voted out of committee on a party line vote, but it was withdrawn before the House could vote on it because the House leadership believed that they did not have the votes. In the Senate, it was introduced for the first time and again failed in committee. But that same year, in 2016 itself, it qualified for the ballot. And later that year, in November, Colorado voters passed the End-of-Life Options Act by a 65 to 35% margin. The law went into effect the very next month, by the end of 2016. What's interesting is that 56% of Colorado physicians supported the option as well. And the Colorado Medical Society, unlike the American Medical Association, remained neutral on the issue. Also interesting was that there was a competing euthanasia measure that failed that same year that would have allowed not just individuals to take medication to end their lives, but would have also permitted physicians to engage in legal euthanasia of patients that desired it. That measure did fail dramatically. And then most recently in the 2017 session, a couple of amendments to ease requirements did fail. So my sense is that the legislature is not willing to really move very far on this issue and is leaving it to the people. So turning to the act itself, the act really concerns the responsibilities and rights of three different groups of three different parties. The first, of course, is the patient. The patient that seeks assisted suicide medication must be an adult, must be a resident of Colorado, So specifically must actually provide evidence of tax returns or show that they're registered to vote in Colorado, or, and this is key because someone else can come out of state to do this, own or lease property in Colorado. So you can sign a lease in Colorado and thereby become a resident for the purpose of this law. An individual cannot seek this because of their old age or disability by itself. What's also notable is that that there are certain waiting periods, as we'll see in a second. But as you can see, various requirements apply for various individuals. They've got to be an adult resident of Colorado. There's got to be a terminal illness with a prognosis of 6 months or less. Must voluntarily express a desire. Must have mental capacity, and it must be an informed decision. Now, if a physician believes that the individual lacks mental capacity, they can still prescribe the medication, but first they must receive a certification from a mental health provider that the individual does have capacity. But if they still are suspicious, there are heightened requirements, including heightened determinations as to whether the individual is experiencing coercion, and they must notify the next of kin. The process requires first 2 oral requests that are separated by 15 days, so there's a 15-day waiting period, followed by a written request signed by 2 witnesses. And the physician afterwards must offer them the right to rescind the request. And then the informed consent process must show that the patient understands the diagnosis and prognosis, that they're at the risk of medication, alternatives, etc. A few interesting points is that the waiting period here, there's only 1 waiting period between the 2 oral requests. Unlike most other states except California, there is no second waiting period. Most other states require there to be a second waiting period for 48 hours after the written request is made before a physician can actually prescribe the medication. I think one of my notes seem to have... Okay. What's also interesting is that there's no interpreter services required. So California... I think only California requires an interpreter service, but we don't have that in Colorado. And then finally, California law requires you to affirm 48 hours before you take the medication. So here, you get prescribed the medication, you can do whatever you want with it. In California, before you take the medication, so you're prescribed the medication, but 48 hours before you take it, you must reaffirm in writing that you are that you are still fully informed and you are doing this of your own volition. Okay, so that's the process. So the other party that's very involved here is the attending physician. The attending physician is really very involved in this process, makes determination of diagnosis, capacity, informed consent, determines Colorado residency, prescribes the medication, refers to consulting physicians and health professionals, and makes required disclosures, right? So the attending physician is very, very much involved in the process. There are conscience limitations, so the attending physician can say that they don't want to carry out the procedure, and the patient must go somewhere else. The physician must then coordinate a transfer of records. The law is not very well drafted because another provision says that they only have to transmit records upon request. But one provision, another provision says they just automatically have to coordinate the transfer of records. You might see problems here when physicians say, well, it goes against my religious beliefs to transfer records relating to assisted suicide. There are cases regarding referrals in the abortion context up before the Supreme Court right now. And so we'll see how that goes, and I'm happy to talk about that more in the Q&A. If your boss doesn't want you to provide end-of-life care, they must let you know in advance. They must let patients know in advance. Otherwise, the physician cannot be subject to disciplinary action for providing end-of-life care. And finally, the patient has to take the medication herself. The physician cannot assist. This is not a euthanasia law. A couple of other parties involved, the successors or the relatives or third parties that aren't the medical provider or the patient. They're involved in a couple of different ways. First, they act as witnesses to the written request. So one witness cannot be a relative, cannot be involved in getting anything from the will, for obvious reasons, I think, right? And cannot be the physician or have power of attorney. Also, if no contract you sign or no provision in will should be affecting your decision, right? That seems fairly straightforward. What's also interesting is that your insurance company, be it life insurance or whatever, cannot take actions, cannot say, oh, if you make this decision, we will rescind your life insurance policy, right? Nor can your health insurance company encourage you to follow, to choose an end-of-life option as opposed to any other option. So the insurance policies they attempt to keep out of this particular decision. And finally, the government is supposed to review compliance with documentation requirements as laid out in a particular provision of the law, because Colorado is trying to track to see which kinds of people are taking advantage of the law to make sure that it's not demographically overly imbalanced, etc. One point is that Oregon, for example, has deeper documentation requirements, as I'll discuss in a second. So this is the first year's report of the kinds of people who've been taking advantage of the law. We see that the median age, I don't think we can see it from here, but the median age is, I believe, in the mid-70s. And that's fairly consistent with the experience in the last 20 years in Oregon. The median age has been about 72 there. Race-wise, Colorado is a fairly diverse state, between the Caucasian and Latino populations. But again, consistent with the Oregon experience, primarily white non-Hispanic individuals have been taking advantage of these laws. What we see in Oregon is that the people who take advantage of these laws historically have also been fairly well-to-do because they tend to have more access to physicians and more choice of physicians who would be willing to provide access to these services and perhaps also are more knowledgeable about the heightened requirements that go into getting access to end-of-life, to an end-of-life option. And then finally, we see the breakdown in marital status and educational attainment. As we see, many individuals have a bachelor's degree, but I guess it's actually not quite as skewed as the last 20 years in Oregon have been. And we see that most individuals come from the Denver metro area. Another interesting point is that many individuals will take, an increasing number of individuals will take the prescription but never actually end up taking the medication. Many of them will die of another condition. Maybe it's the condition that led them to seek the medication in the first place. The conditions vary. In Colorado, 63% of individuals had cancer, and then ALS, heart disease, and COPD were the other sort of conditions that saw individuals seeking this option. And I think that sort of lays out the statistics. I think the biggest concern that some individuals have from the Oregon experience is that the statistics there suggest that many individuals seek to take these options. About 90% of individuals say that they fear a loss of autonomy. 40% say that they fear being a burden on individuals. So Oregon requires you to track the reasons that the patients give for following this option. Colorado does not. So I think I'll stop there. I'm not quite sure how I am on time. But yeah, I think I'm a little over. So I'll stop there, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
All right, thanks a lot, Craig. Next we have Martin Gunderson from Macalester College, who is going to jump from the facts into the philosophy.
Thank you, Ben, and good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to start by assuming, just for the sake of argument, that there is a moral right to engage in physician-assisted suicide, as well as a legal right. But even if there is a strong moral right, there's still a question of whether one ought to exercise that right and whether physicians ought to be willing to go along with it. So I'll argue that in various cases, there really is good reason to take advantage of that from the patient's point of view. I'll also argue that physicians have a very strong reason to be willing to prescribe lethal medications to patients who meet the standard of the law, or at least to recommend a physician who will. The first thing I'd like to note is that I would argue that life is an instrumental rather than an intrinsic value. That is, biological life has value insofar as it supports other values that the living person has. I think we can all imagine cases where our biological life would have no value whatsoever to us. Persistent vegetative state, for example, perhaps overwhelming pain. So in thinking about physician-assisted suicide, it's worth asking whether our biological life really supports the kind of deep values that we have. And again, it's interesting to look at the statistics coming out of Oregon. You might think that what would incline people to use this act is overwhelming pain. But in fact, as Craig noted, in Oregon, 89.5% cite a loss of autonomy, loss of self-governance as a reason for opting to ask for a lethal prescription. A similar number cite loss of abilities to engage in actions, perform actions one finds enjoyable. Loss of dignity gets cited 65.4% of the time. Being a burden to family and others, roughly 50%. Finally, we get down to inadequate pain relief, and that's about 35.3%. So it strikes me, I'm sympathetic with these reasons. It strikes me that loss of autonomy, loss of being able to self-govern one's life, also includes a loss of being able to achieve whatever else one values in many cases. I think that there are things that are valuable for any person, things that are needed for a flourishing life. These include having, I think Aristotle gets this right, having friendship, a kind of relationships of reciprocal goodwill. It includes having a kind of character that enables one to flourish. But in terminal illness, there can be conditions that undermine these kinds of values. In addition, people create their own meaning, have additional values that inform their lives, and some of the conditions in terminal illness can undermine these as well. Insofar as these values get undermined, one's interest in biological life is diminished, and it can be diminished to the point where engaging in physician-assisted suicide is reasonable. There's still a question of whether physicians are obligated to, morally obligated, to fill out these prescriptions, and some would object mightily. The first thing I'd like to notice is that physicians are in a profession. This profession is guarded by the state. It controls, it controls who can enter the profession. It controls who gets access to all sorts of medications and drugs, but especially lethal medications. The only way you can get these legally is to go to somebody who's empowered by law to prescribe them. So then you might ask, well, what's the role of the medical profession? What's the role of a physician? I would argue that the role of a physician is not the preservation of health and life, and certainly not the preservation of health and life at all costs. Rather, I would argue that the role of the physician is to enable patients to act on their own values, to control their own life and health. The physician works with the patient when things go well in two ways. The physician can contribute factual knowledge. Will these medications be effective? What is the prognosis for your illness? What needs to be done with your injury? But it's the patient really who's got to contribute the values that inform the kind of medical decisions that are made. I'm not saying that the physician is just a tool of the patient. The physician can discuss with the patient his or her values, but I think it's not up to the physician to determine or dictate what the values of the patient will be, but to enable the patient to carry out those values. There has been a long history of this. I remember the case of Karen Ann Quinlan, maybe back in the 60s, who had a persistent vegetative state. Her parents wanted her taken off life support. Slowly over the years, patient autonomy has grown, the ability of patients to control what will happen to them, advanced directives that help patients. And I see this as another step in the process. Patients have a vital interest not only in how they live, but in how they die. And part of health care is helping patients be able to determine how they will die with the best medical treatment. It might be, physicians might say, well, look, a physician might say, I'm really against killing. This is not the role of the medical profession. And granted, I'm not killing, I'm giving a patient a lethal medication, but it's a kind of complicity. But I think I would reply in two ways. First, I would say the kind of complicity is really removed. The physician writes the prescription, but these prescriptions are not always filled. And in cases where they are filled, the patient does not always take the medication. I think in Oregon, in 2016, 114 patients received medication, but only 36 died of taking the medication. The others died of a different cause. The physician could reason, what I'm doing is not killing the patient. What I'm doing is giving the patient the power to determine how he or she will end his or her life. I'm giving the patient an out. I can remonstrate with the patient, or talk to the patient about values, talk to the patient about options, but in the end, it's the patient's decision. And I've also argued that the patient's decision can sometimes be informed by values that have been deep, long-term values throughout the person's life. What's crucial, I think, from the point of view of the patient is being able to ask yourself, what are my deep long-term values? What would it be to die in accord with those values? If you have the values of Albert Schweitzer, early in the 20th century, who just was in favor of all forms of life and would never kill an insect if he could avoid it, then don't take advantage of the act. On the other hand, if your values are different, if you think that what's absolutely crucial is being able to maintain a certain level of self-governance, and you can see that this will be lost, but you're still competent enough to use the medication and get the medication, then I think you've got reasons that can make an informed decision. So from the patient's point of view, sometimes I believe it's morally permissible. From the physician's point of view, I think, look, you're a professional and you're in a democracy, and your role is to help your patients or clients to be able to control their health. Incidentally, just as a story, for a while I worked as an attorney. I went to the law school, became an attorney, and thought, I'll always keep a case on the back burner with the Civil Liberties Union. And for a while I did that. What I found was some of my clients would want to do things that I thought, oh my goodness, I don't know if that's morally justified. They want an unlawful detainer action against some person who's lived in this apartment for whatever. But I thought my role as an attorney is to enable this person to exercise his or her rights under the law. And I believe as a professional, that's what I needed to do, and not just judge for the client. And I think the same thing of the physician. It's up to the physician to help the patient exercise his or her remaining autonomy to decide how he or she will die. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Martin. Next, we're going to have Christopher Tollefsen from the University of South Carolina, who's going to take an opposing position.
Thanks very much. It's a pleasure to be here. I was here, it's the second time I've been on this campus. I was here 9 years ago this month. I was looking through old emails to figure that out. I was here 9 years ago so that I could defend the claim that unborn embryos have rights. So it's good to be here now to do something uncontroversial. I think that's nice. We were asked to discuss the question, is it morally acceptable to do what the law allows? And there's something I think that's interesting about that question. Usually we ask it in the other way. We ask whether what the law is considering is something that's moral, right? We assume that the law should follow morality. But this question asks the opposite, whether the law makes a difference to morality. And I think that sometimes it could. So suppose you think that there's nothing morally wrong with marijuana use, and accordingly with at least some degree of marijuana sale. Still, the fact that it was against the law could give you a moral reason not to engage in selling, buying, or using marijuana. And then it would seem that when the law changes, then your moral reasons change. Now you have a moral reason. Now you no longer have a moral reason where once you did. And maybe things are like that with regard to physician-assisted suicide. Maybe once the law is there, now actually morality follows the law. But I think that things are unlike this, where physician-assisted suicide and other forms of so-called assisted death are concerned. And I'm going to make this case in two stages. First, I'll argue that the deepest and most principled reason against physician-assisted suicide remains unchanged. And second, I'll argue that the pragmatic, consequence-oriented reasons that are often used to govern public policy, even for those unconvinced by the deep moral reason, also still remain valid for individuals when the law changes. I want to say that, and this is interesting, Martin and I have never met before, we've not communicated in any way, and yet our papers perfectly track one another as inverse images of one another. The first point that I'm going to make is basically arguing the contrary of the first point that Martin made, and the second point that I'm going to make is basically arguing the contrary of the second part that Martin made. I think that makes sense. That's a good thing. It indicates that I think that our debate is tracking the reasons that are typically taken to be important here. So the first part of my argument is the principled argument. Should citizens take advantage of the legal permission to obtain physician assistance in hastening their own death? I'm going to argue no. And my argument here is similar to that of Colorado native and Supreme Court Justice Neil Gorsuch. Like Justice Gorsuch, I believe that human life is indeed a fundamental or basic good of intrinsic and not merely instrumental value. Again, the direct contrary of the claim that Martin argued for. Thus, its value is not exhausted when the human being whose life it is becomes unable through infirmity or disability to do other things with his or her life. Now, why do I think this? I'm going to give two reasons why I think that life has not merely instrumental value. First, it seems possible to act for the sake of life itself on occasion, with no further end in view, no further reason for acting, as when we save a drowning child, right, without giving some consideration to what further things that child's life might accomplish. We do it simply in order to preserve the child's life. That makes life unlike merely instrumental goods such as money, which are always pursued for the sake of something else. So life is valuable, it seems to me, for its own sake and not merely for the sake of further ends. The second reason for thinking that life has what I'm calling basic and intrinsic value is that I think that human persons, all of us here, have intrinsic value. And I also think that human persons are fundamentally human beings, living human organisms rather than disembodied minds or spirits. Right? If you look, we have a mirror conveniently located. If you look in the mirror, what you will see in the mirror is, in fact, a living human organism. And I think that living organism is you. Right? You are that animal that you would see in the mirror. If that's true, then our biological lives are intrinsic to our being and our existence in the way that the biological life of any animal is intrinsic to it. But I think it wouldn't really be coherent to say that we, all of us, have intrinsic value, but our biological lives do not, if those lives are, in fact, intrinsic to our existence. So human life is a good of great and intrinsic value, it seems to me. Now, how should we respond to that value? In the same way that we should respond to the intrinsic good of, say, friendship. Friendships should be pursued and promoted, and I hope everybody here is doing that. But I think that it's also wrong, ever, to directly act contrary to a friendship, either as an end or as a means. And to put this in another way, it's always wrong to intentionally damage or destroy your friendship. Now, of course, sometimes we do things, right, because we think we're obligated to do them or because we think we need to say something that's important and true that will hurt our friends and hurt our friendships, that our friends won't love. But when we do that, the damage to our friendship is a side effect. It's not intended. And so it's very unlike, for example, Judas's betrayal, just to take a seasonal example, Judas's betrayal of his friend Jesus for 30 silver pieces. Now, similarly, we should not act directly against the good of human life, nor should we intend damage or destruction to it, either as an end or as a means. Nor should we aid someone who intends to do such damage. So intentional self-killing is wrong, as is aiding in such self-killing. And it's worth pointing out that this judgment is perfectly compatible with the thought that refusing burdensome medical treatment is permissible, even if death is hastened, because the death is not, in such cases, intended. It's a foreseen side effect, which can thus sometimes be permissible. So the view that you should never intentionally kill somebody is perfectly compatible with the view that it's also permissible to say no to a variety of measures that you think might be burdensome, even though they might preserve your life. Right? This is not a save at all costs position. Part two, right, second part of the argument, some slightly more pragmatic arguments. Not everyone, should go without saying, will be convinced by the argument that I just gave, though I think that acceptance of something like that argument was a great, albeit precarious, cultural achievement. Here's another great cultural achievement: the creation through time of a medical profession whose central commitment was a commitment to human health and life. Those who professed that commitment professed always, as the familiar maxim puts it, to heal and care and never to harm. Those who so professed thus would not kill intentionally, for they understood such killing always to be a harm. The advantages of having a profession like that, right? And of course the profession can develop any profession can develop in a variety of different ways, and the medical profession can change. It probably is changing. But the advantages of having a profession like that, like the one that we did in fact have, seem to me considerable. Physicians treat the most vulnerable among us, infants, the aged, the very ill, the greatly disabled, yet they also have immense and ever-increasing power. And so it's no wonder that the well-known clinical ethicist Richard Zahner has asked, why don't physicians act like Gyges in Plato's Republic? Anybody familiar with Gyges in the Republic? Gyges, you'll recognize the reference even if you've never heard of Gyges. Gyges found a ring that when he put it on his finger and turned him invisible. And with his invisible ring, he killed the king and married the king's wife. Why don't more physicians act like that? Well, I think it's partly because of the basic core commitments that they have. The power that physicians have demand of patients great trust and demand of physicians great trustworthiness. Consider those patients who are in pain and suffering at the end of their life, who seek palliation from their physicians. Knowledge on the patient's part that her physician will never intend her death creates a space within which the physician can work aggressively to relieve suffering. On the other hand, concern that one solution for suffering might be the patient's death can quickly erode patient trust and lead to more tentative palliative efforts. Further point, but in the same theme. There exists in our society a more or less absolute legal and social prohibition on intentional killing, and this benefits all of us. Life would be a lot more precarious if individual citizens had to make on a case-by-case judgment, right? If they had to make a judgment about who could live or shouldn't live, or who we could intentionally kill or who we shouldn't intentionally kill. Our basic rule is this: that sort of killing is just not done, and our lives are greatly improved by us not having to worry about whether other people are thinking this about us, or for us having to think about it with regard to other people. But there are exceptions to this rule. The police, those charged with carrying out capital punishment, and the military. Why are they exceptions? Well, presumably because they serve the public and not private good, and this seems to many a sufficient justification for carving out an exception to the prohibition on intentional killing. But all forms of physician aid in dying extend that exception to a category of essentially private actors, namely physicians, who are now entitled to make judgments about who may and who may not be intentionally killed or assisted in death, and to aid or carry out such killing. But let's return to the police for a moment. We're right now, in our society, in the middle of a large controversy and conversation about the ways in which police power to kill is potentially being abused. Are police too quick to exercise that power? Do they do so in ways that do not serve the public good, but instead are occasionally governed by bias, prejudice, or self-interest, rather than a disciplined concern for the public good? What further safeguards do we need? Physician-assisted suicide and the like give physicians a similar power to the police, in addition to their already considerable technical powers, in a domain that's vastly more private than the world of police and occupied exclusively by vulnerable people. Should we not expect the considerations of self-interest, bias, and prejudice are likewise capable of shaping physician judgment and exercise of this power? Why does this matter for our guiding question? The considerations just raised about the nature of the medical profession and the way in which an entitlement to kill or to aid in killing threatens both the profession and its treatment of the vulnerable are among the many important considerations traditionally raised by the policy arguments against physician-assisted suicide. But I think that they give patients continuing reasons, even after the legalization of physician-assisted suicide, to refuse such treatment. I have perfect. Why? Well, only a sustained pattern of such refusals, it seems to me, can help to maintain the profession of medicine in a way that avoids the ring of Gyges problem. As more and more persons request physician-assisted suicide, physicians will become more and more disposed to see killing, a form of harm, as a part of their professional vocation. That itself is an erosion of their vocation's most central norms, but it also opens the profession up to new and pervasive opportunities for abuse, opportunities that will be carried out in a much more secretive context than the abuses of the police are. We can't really afford to deny the police some powers for the use of force, though even here one might well question whether we've afforded them too much, by contrast with other countries such as Britain, where possession of a firearm by the police is relatively rare. But for the healthcare profession, the can't afford calculus seems like it should cut in exactly the opposite way. We can't afford to live without physicians who are devoted to always healing and caring and never harming. Asking for physician-assisted suicide, like legalizing it, erodes that devotion. A refusal to ask on the part of those not committed, even those not committed to the inviolability of human life, helps sustain that devotion. It's a worthy act of witness and self-sacrifice that benefits the common good. Thank you.
when you began speaking, my first thought was, I'm not convinced. I mean, it seems to me intuitively that life is an intrinsic value. The problem is that the reason I wasn't fully convinced by Christopher was that just as life is an intrinsic value, I think there are a bunch of other intrinsic values that you refer to, such as individual autonomy. And I think the fundamental problem here is the problem that arises arguably in the abortion context, which is you have what seem to be two intrinsic values that are at odds with each other, and how do you reconcile them? And so if an individual wants to make a decision, it is their life, but it is also their autonomy at stake. On whether doctors can do this, or whether they're obligated to do this, I have to say you completely convinced me. And I was on the fence. Partially, and for a couple of reasons. One is that I believe that I believe that so I sort of subscribe to Elizabeth Anscombe's framework of motivation, right? So you've got so doctors shouldn't worry about what the person has done in the past. The doctor shouldn't worry about what the person might do in the future with medical assistance. What doctors can only worry about is what their own actions are, their interpretive motives, so to speak. And so to my mind, so that's the way I think about this in the LGBT and abortion context, and you've sort of shown me how to think about this in this context. I also don't think that there's a clear line at all between private actors and public actors. One can, when a doctor is hemmed in by all sorts of regulations related to Medicaid and Medicare, I teach health law, in many ways doctors are far more constrained by the law than the police are. Doctors are far more constrained in their decision-making than police are, and the biases that we see from the police, we don't actually see. In the 20 years that Oregon has had this law, we do not see these kinds of biases being replicated. So I think the hypotheticals about the possibility of biases being replicated don't seem to be borne out by the evidence. Thank you.
Maybe I'll just stand so I can see everybody. I hope you don't mind. So I've been thinking about persons having intrinsic value, and Chris's reply. It strikes me that, yeah, maybe persons do have intrinsic value, but I'm still not willing to go along with biological life having intrinsic value. Think of persons who are, before the passage of this act, facing death, perhaps dying of cancer, and there may come a point at which they decide it's just not worthwhile being treated anymore. Even though it will end my biological life sooner if I don't continue taking these this chemotherapy, I think that can often be a wise decision, and a decision that sometimes the family would agree on. And if that can be a wise decision, why not say, well, I'd be better off not having this life continue, and there's a possibility of ending it with medication. I also think what it is to be a person is to be someone who has rights and can exercise those rights. And part of what that means is being able to exercise one's autonomy and to guide one's life. As far as rescuing, one thing I want to say too, think about, for example, an anencephalic child, a child born without a higher brain. It strikes me that we don't want to just keep the child alive for as long as we can on the grounds that it has biological life. Its biological life will never result in personhood, will never feed the kind of values that enable the exercise of rights or make the exercise of rights worthwhile. The final one I wanted to say is that when I think about saving a child, yeah, I'd save it right away without questioning it. I wouldn't think, I wonder what the child's. But part of it is that I know darn well that the child will have values, that the life almost certainly will be important to that child. And I think it's important for the to have that kind of quick instinct of trying to save the child. One last thing that we could discuss more is I really do disagree about the role of the medical profession, that its role is to just preserve health. And I think when the doctor and the patient discuss whether ending treatment is a viable option, even though the patient will die, part of what the doctor and patient are doing is deciding what's best for this person, as opposed to what will preserve the person's life and health. And finally, I agree that doctors should try to avoid harm, but I would also argue that harm consists in treating a person in a way that is not consistent with his or her values, and not allowing a person to act on his or her values.
I guess I'll stand too. I'm actually going to lean so I can see cool. This heater is on. 75 degrees out. I'll make maybe 3 quick points. And one, this is no more than a sketch of where I see 2 very different ideas about what a profession is. And these ideas extend beyond just our conception of medicine. I think that all the practices that we view as professions, think about the profession of teaching, the profession of medicine, the profession of being a lawyer, the profession of being a pastor or a priest. All of these professions have in common their care and concern for people who are, in one way or another, are extremely vulnerable, on my view. Right? There's a different way that you can go, and presumably there's many ways in the middle, right? But you could go in a different way that focuses much more on their relationship to the autonomy of the various people that are being cared for. And Martin's conception of medicine, it seemed to me, went in that direction. And then, interestingly enough, so did his conception of the law. Right? I agree that it does not go all the way towards making doctors or lawyers a tool of people for the pursuit of their autonomous purposes. But I do think that there are going to be differences in how we cash out the consequences of these different images of what professions are all about. The second point that I'll make has to do with the value of biological life and of persons who seem to possess no more or little more than biological life. If it was really the case that an anencephalic child or a person in a persistent vegetative state or a permanent coma had no more value in their life, then it seems like we couldn't do them harm. But it seems to be that we can do them harm. If you take a patient in a persistent vegetative state and dress them up like a clown so that you can make fun of them, you're profoundly harming their dignity, even if they never know about it. Presumably they won't ever know about that. I don't see how that could be the case. I don't see how we could make sense of the idea of harming such people if their lives had no value. 2 final quick points just to indicate, again, large issues. I do think that, again, my view is consistent with the idea that you can say no to a variety of different things. And the reasons that you say no don't follow from your sense that your life is no longer worth living or that it's no longer of value, but that the benefits that you're going to get compared to the burdens that you're going to suffer from the various things that are proposed to you just don't add up. Right? This is going to cost me an awful lot of money. It's going to create side effects for me that are going to incapacitate me and make it impossible for me to relate in a properly social way with my family in the remaining days that I have. Those are good reasons for saying no to something, but those are different from suicidal reasons. Those do not involve choosing death as either an end or as a means. And then finally, in response to something that Greg was saying right towards the end, right? Can we expect, should we expect, is there some evidence for the presence of bias in the medical community, right? When vulnerable patients of marginalized populations are at risk? I think there is some evidence, some of it is anecdotal. I have a physician friend who teaches at Duke, formerly worked in Chicago, the south side of Chicago, in both North Carolina and Chicago. He's dealt with a number of minority patients who are deeply afraid of hospice care because they think of hospice care as largely an opportunity for them to be bullied into a quicker death. Right? The fact that 90-something% of the people who have made use of Oregon's physician-assisted suicide law are white, right, could be because they're better educated or because they have a better sense of their possibilities, but it could be because this is largely a mark of a particular kind of self-conception of oneself as an autonomous person is largely something for people who are relatively well off, and people who feel themselves at risk don't really want to take advantage of it for that reason. I think if you've read, and perhaps somebody here has, but it's absolutely worth it, a fantastic and amazing and depressing article in the New Yorker about Jahai McGrath, who was an African-American girl in California who was diagnosed as being brain dead. You leave that article with the suspicion, the strong suspicion, that part of the way that she was related to as an African-American girl was different from the way that she would have been related to by her physicians if she was an upper class or middle class white American. And I think that's worth worrying about.
Thanks. We'll go back around one more time and ask one brief follow-up question. One thing about the law here is that often comes under discussion is the restriction to terminal cases. So there's a certain set of people that are allowed to end their life in this way, and it's defined in a clear way in the law. So one question is that restriction, is a restriction like that a good idea? Is this a well-formed restriction? If you want to get into the legal aspect of that. And it might be, is this restriction motivated by the reasons for it? So you don't have to think that that taking advantage of this is permissible, but is this restriction a good idea? Should people who support this law support anybody ending their life? How do we think about whether that restriction is well-formed in this case or a good idea in general? Please try to keep it brief. If you don't have any thoughts off the top of your head, that's fine. Take another 2 minutes or so.
So this is more of an ethical question. So I'm going to leave it to these guys, but I also want to just frame add to the question a little bit, which is to say, so assuming you believe arguendo that human life intrinsically has value, and you of course do, how would you? This seems to come down to the clash between individual autonomy versus a belief in intrinsic value in life, which both seem to be good. So how do you deal with that?
Okay. I think, first of all, that the law is wise now to restrict it to the terminally ill. My worry is that it's important for states to advance slowly in this direction and see what happens. I think if cultures change too radically, can produce a reaction, and so I wouldn't want to just open the floodgates and say anyone who wants lethal prescription can get one. I think let's see what kind of statistics come out of Colorado. Keep looking at what's happening in Oregon, Washington, California, and now I think Vermont. See whether there are abuses that we need to worry about. If not, we can take the next step. One thing that gives me pause in this kind of conservative position is I very much worry for myself, for example, about if I ever got an Alzheimer's diagnosis and know that I will slowly decline and may be kept alive for some time while I'm incompetent, but yet will lose my competence long before I'm able to take advantages of the Colorado Act. Minnesota doesn't have, I'd have to move out here. So that worries me, and it may be a step down the road, but for now I think caution is worth a lot for a state like Colorado.
To say there's obviously a lot worse places that you could move to. This is pretty nice. I think that the law is very unstable, and the rationale for it is very unstable. And the reasons that are given for why you should have a law like this are basically two. One is an autonomy-based reason, and one is a suffering-based reason. And the autonomy-based reason has no principle, no stopping principle within it that says that your autonomy should only be important if you have 6 months left to live rather than a year left to live. Or even that your autonomy is only important if you have a terminal diagnosis. I mean, everybody's going to die eventually. So if autonomy matters and you're going to die eventually, then you have a kind of terminal diagnosis. Why not exercise your autonomy in ways that you think are appropriate? And in fact, people do think that it's important for their life to have a particular kind of close, and some want it to end well short of a period when they have 6 months to live. The suffering principle, it seems to me, cuts against the requirement that we have, that this only be delivered on the basis of people's request. If suffering is what matters, there are people who suffer who are incompetent. There are people who can't make that request. And so again, the extension of the law to incompetent children, to incompetent adults, well away from the framework that makes physician-assisted suicide possible, towards a framework that requires something like, even not just voluntary, but eventually non-voluntary euthanasia. These seem like inertias that are built into the nature of the law. Should I say something just very quickly in response to the question about...
Let's go.
Okay.
So the way this will work, the floor is now open for questions. I will come out to you and let you speak a question to the mic, and I'll come back up here and hand the mic to them. For the sake of time and let other people speak, we won't have any opportunity for a follow-up. So we'll have a reception afterward if you'd like to talk further. If you want to hear more about what they said, or you're not sure they quite got to your question, you can accost them about that afterward. So this way everybody gets a chance to get a word in. I'll remind you again, as all of us keep forgetting, stand when you speak so that we can get you on camera. So I'll go down the middle aisle with this microphone. So raise your hand if you've got a question you would like to ask.
My question is a little bit naive, but it's the piece that's missing for me, and that is, why is it necessary to have physician-assisted suicide? What is the psychology of people who are ready to be finished? Why don't they do it themselves? Is it that hard to commit suicide?
So who wants to take
I think there are two reasons. One, I think society's wise to let physicians control certain drugs, including barbiturates that are typically used in this. The second thing is that I think it is hard to commit suicide. If I think of using household poisons, prescriptions, the suicide isn't certain. If I think of something like shooting myself, it's much more certain, but also ghastly. So finding a way of dying that is neither ghastly but yet not uncertain, I think takes us to physician-assisted suicide.
I don't understand why you're talking about physician-assisted suicide when the law seems to require that the patient take the medication themselves. The physician is not there, and I don't know about your practices, but my doctor does not demand that I take her recommendations when she suggests that I take a drug. I, for instance, don't take antibiotics because I'm allergic to them. And so she may recommend that other people take antibiotics, but she knows that I'm not going to. I have a right to take a drug, and the doctor is there to help me take or not take what I have asked for. But it's not physicians-assisted suicide. This is something different. This is medical aid in dying, meaning that a doctor simply writes a prescription and it's up to the patient as to whether they even use that prescription or not. That seems like a completely different animal. I don't understand why Christopher is talking about physician-assisted suicide. It's not suicide that the law specifically says. You have died of whatever it is that you were going to be dying of, that they said you had 6 months to live.
Well, thank you, actually, and this gives me an opportunity I'll start with the very last thing that you said, which I think is a very important thing. It's obviously not true that the patient dies of their original medical condition if they take a medical prescription in order to bring about their death. I think that itself is a very strange feature of both this law and the Oregon law. It engages in a kind of dishonesty about what's actually happening. I think that aid in dying, assistance in dying is similarly euphemistic, not to the same extent that basically falsifying the cause of death is, but I think it's euphemistic. We don't like the word suicide. We recognize that suicide is a horrible thing, right? But physician-assisted suicide, is there a suicide when it's been successfully carried out? Yes, there is, right? Has it taken place with the assistance of a physician? Yes, it has, in the same way that when you are cured by the medicine that your physician gives you, the physician has assisted you. When your surgeon takes out a cancer, you have been cured by the assistance of the physician. In this case, you wish to die, and the physician assists you in that. It's true that the physician has not done it, right? But the physician has assisted. So it seems to me that physician-assisted suicide actually gives us a very accurate description of what's going on. And the desire for descriptions that move away from the actual facts of the case, whether what we're describing is the practice itself or what we're doing when we're filling out the cause of death, I think is a sign of a kind of unease that should give us pause and should lead us to think more about what's really going on. Do you want to?
I'll say just a word too, because I really agree to a very large extent. When I use the term physician-assisted suicide, it's often because it's just been in the literature so much. But I think the complicity of the physician, insofar as it exists, is really tenuous, because the physician is writing the prescription, but the patient may not fill it out and may not take the drug. And if the patient does take the drug, he or she is the one who's taking the drug.
Well, just a legal question. I mean, if in some other context, put aside the physician context, right? If in some other context, somebody indicates that they wish to create suicide, and somebody gives them the means by which they might later do so, right? What kind of legal liability comes with that outside the medical context? It seems to me that there is some legal liability that's going to come with providing means that may or may not be used in a later suicide. Is that correct?
I'd like a great answer to that. I think it might be correct, but we could disagree.
Yeah, so there have been a couple of cases where that's happened, and I think, and every commentator on those cases has seen that as a case of prosecutorial overreach. Because, by that standard, right, I mean, the gun maker can be held liable. I mean, you have tort liability that just goes back. In civil cases, this has happened, where, we've actually tried to cabin tort liability because we just think it's bizarre to extend liability when the proximate cause is someone's independent decision, right? And so if you have, so let's say the gun maker sells something, if there is an intervening agent, namely the person who commits the shooting, it's very hard to go off the gun manufacturer at a civil level, and it's impossible to go off them at the criminal level because you've got an intervening agent. And I think that's the point here. But again, I'm sympathetic to your question, but I think, because I do think there's an intervening agent who makes the moral decision, but at the same time, if the prescription is made for the purpose of allowing them to do so, I can see how the word assistance would be used. If my friend lends me his truck so I could move my own furniture, he's helping me.
And I'm just going to pop in here quickly. I think it's important to distinguish two issues. One, whether we should talk about in terms of physician assistance, and the other, whether we should talk in terms of suicide. So the first thing that came up was that is it quite right to say they just died of some other cause or they intentionally ended their life? That's the question of, should we use the term suicide? And then this other question, how responsible is the physician? How should we talk about that? Is another question. So there are really two distinct questions of terminology here that are worth considering. More questions. Let's go here.
Who makes the determination, or who should make the determination, that life has intrinsic value? Is it the individual? Is it society? Is it government? Is it religious organizations? Who actually is and should be making that determination?
Okay, I'll go first. I think the answer is, in a sense, we should. The question sort of presupposes that there's a kind of expert who can make that decision, but there isn't. This is something we need to reflect on as a group and a society and for ourselves. And it seems to me, looking at it, that in many cases, our biological life just isn't worth preserving if we're suffering enough approaching death anyway. So
That sounds like the individual.
Yeah, we sounded like the individual.
Yeah.
You didn't imply it that way?
Okay, so sure, it's the individual, but I'm wary because I think I don't want to be driven into subjectivism. I think there really can be arguments given for why life is instrumental that might persuade you. And if I can persuade you, then I think, oh, so that's a good reason. And it isn't just me. But I don't think there are experts who get to say. Sure.
Because here we have a point of agreement. Vocationally driven, I suspect. I think it's important to recognize that neither Martin nor I are making any decisions for anybody. I can barely make decisions for my children. They resist at every turn. I'm not sure why. What we're doing is making arguments, right? We're giving reasons that you can then consider and make not. I think a decision even is not the right word for what we would encourage you to do, but an assessment. Right? Make a judgment. Make a determination as to which of the reasons you think are the most cogent and sound, and then if you then act accordingly. Is it reasonable that some of the actions that you would engage in, having made a decision that Martin is right or that I'm right or that somebody else is right, is it reasonable to think that some of those actions will be social and will have social consequences? Absolutely. These are decisions that we have to make. Right? I mean, nobody who supports physician-assisted suicide said, well, let's just, we don't want to impose anything, right? But every decision that we make, right, has some cost for somebody. Right? We have to make these decisions. The way to make them is to get people together, to share the reasons that they have, to share the arguments that they have for their positions, and to then continue the conversation, and hopefully the decisions will be better informed and move us closer to the truth.
And it still comes down to the individual.
Well, in a way, I think that's inevitable. I mean, individuals are the judges of truth. Let's see.
Thank you all. A lot of thoughts rolling around up here. Just to address what you just said was basically, in order to arrive at one's decision, it should be a process in which all the stakeholders, if you will, have been apprised in the best of all possible worlds. You've come to a consensus with that group of people that will possibly be affected by that, which has been pretty much my approach. Family, friends, any of the stakeholders over the last few years, we've been through that process, and then to take this and jump to the idea of autonomy. All of us, I think, have been told that we are autonomous people, and we're hailed, patted on the back when we do things that look to be autonomous. Well, I take that seriously, and so if that's what this culture demands, I'm going to take that and run with it to the very end. It will be my choice, based on a process. And here again, it goes to some of what you said. Why do we need physicians? I'm actually thinking about how can I make plans so that I don't need to depend on anybody. Because who knows where this is going to be? Who knows where this is going to go? But I will take care of myself. Thank you.
So I want to apologize first for something which is Just if what you do is you teach philosophy, then everything gets a response and everything gets an argument. Right? So it's nothing personal. Right? I think we need to distinguish between it being the case, because there's nothing else that it could be. There's no other way that it could be. That everybody needs to think of these things for themselves, right, and make an assessment. That's different from it being the case that however any particular person thinks of it, and whatever assessment they come to, and whatever judgment they make, it's right because it's theirs. People can think through things in the best of, under the best circumstances, with the best will in the world, in the most careful possible way, and still get it wrong. And to me, in your comments, there was a move from what I think Martin and I are agreeing about, which is that we're trying to play a part in a process that gives people, right, including ourselves, right, the best reasons that they can for considering what the right answer to something or the wrong answer is to something. There seems to be a move from that to, if it's my decision, then therefore it's right. Right? That's, I think, a point I disagree with, and I suspect that you do as well. Autonomy is an important value, but it's not a self-ratifying value. It's not something, I think, right, that simply in virtue of something being autonomous, that is therefore the correct something.
Autonomy has been central to every argument that's come up, which is why we're not resolving anything, because it's a central element of what makes life valuable. If biological life is an intrinsic value, the central thing to biological life is autonomy. If you look at any living system, any living organism other than a plant, okay, living things, anything that knows it needs to die goes off and dies. It has the autonomy to do that. There isn't any intervening system that's going to prevent it from doing that until you start involving people. So I think, it keeps coming up in every comment that's made, is this issue of autonomy. So I don't think it's a side value. I don't think it's something irrelevant. I think it's actually central to the argument.
So I'll say, as I'm walking back over here, I think they'll agree with the last part of that for sure. Who wants to take on that? I think there's just some clarification to be done here about how we use that term in philosophy.
Sure, I'll take it on very quickly. I think you're right that it is central. And by autonomy, I mean a kind of moral agency, being able to formulate reasons that can then shape your behavior so that you're governing your own life according to your own reasons, as opposed to an organism that's just got a kind of causal autonomy in the sense that it's going through life. Used in connection with humans, it means being able to act on reasons, come up with a plan of what you think is a good life. One quick other thing, I'd like to distinguish autonomy from a kind of rugged individuality. So I think you're right, autonomy does involve taking account of others, and hopefully the values you have in self-governance means that you give your friends and family a voice, even if it's you get the final say. So it's a bit different from rugged individualism.
My name is Dave Hibbert. I'm a medical doctor. I've lived in Colorado for 50 years in Boulder, and I'm now restricting my practice to individuals who want to pursue the medical aid in dying. And if there are any of you here who have not had your questions answered, I'd be glad to discuss them with you.
There's no off button on this mic, by the way, which is why you're getting all distracted.
For those of us that have been in Colorado for over 50 years, we had a very controversial governor named Dick Lamb, who had the gall to suggest that there were socio-economic reasons for old people to actually die. I would like your opinions on whether there's... I wanted to, I didn't want to really put the duty, but responsibility.
He said duty.
Right, but not to put, 100-year-old people on life support for the rest of history.
I think that the elderly, those who have terminal illness, do not have a duty to die, do not have a responsibility to die. I think he was wrong about that. I wrote a paper once in the Hastings Center report called, it was on being a burden. And I think there's something to be said in a relationship for allowing oneself to be a burden. It's sort of being true to the caring relationship where you each care for one another. There may be a responsibility to stop consuming huge amounts of medical resources after a while, to bankrupt the family, but I do not think that there's a duty to die. I think it just gives, I yourself, I think it's, yeah.
I just want to say that I completely agree with that. And including the part about considering the resources that one expends, but this is part of your life throughout the whole of it. This is not unique to the elderly. Right? At every point in your life, if you're a good steward of the things that you have, then you pay attention to whether you're using them well and whether you're using them at the expense of other people. So I don't think that the considerations that you should bring on board, right, thinking about medical technologies and expenditures that you're making use of late in life are really fundamentally different from the kinds of responsibilities that you have throughout your life to wisely use the things that, that you have.
If you have, over a period of time, no matter what age you are, a determination to die, I think if my daughter wanted to kill herself, that's her business. Of course, I wouldn't want her to, but, I think that's a person's right. But I wonder what you think, particularly if it's not just an impulse and, and you've determined over a period of time that someone does want to die. Why shouldn't they?
I think it's a statement of the value of life, and this is what I want to end. It's an affirmation of life, actually.
It's hard for me to see how it's an affirmation of life. I mean, it's an abandonment of life. It's
just when it ends. It's a matter of time.
Well, if my 25-year-old child decides that they want to die, right, because they think that their life is the only reason that could justify that is that their life isn't worth living. Right? It seems right. It would be hard to see how they could be justified in that choice otherwise, and it's difficult for me to see how that judgment can be correct, right? Just as a matter of decision, right? That simply as a matter of, I no longer think that I should be alive, I no longer think that my life is worth living, that simply in virtue of having made that decision, that they become right. It seems to me that the sort of thing that people can be wrong about, and this is one of the reasons that we think that suicide is a very socially important problem. We're concerned with the effects that one suicide has on other people wanting to commit suicide. If we thought simply, well, this is just how it is, then we wouldn't be quite so concerned. We believe that people can get this badly wrong. And when we think, although we differ in our judgment about when they get that badly wrong.
Maybe they think the same thing as you.
Well, they certainly do. Right? Some do. But that itself doesn't settle whether they're right or I'm right. The fact of disagreement doesn't mean that there is no answer. Right? It simply means that we, again, need to consider talking about what the correct answer is. But I do think that there is a correct answer. And I think that there's actually vast social conversions on the idea that simply deciding that your life is no longer worth living doesn't make it so.
I guess we agree to disagree.
I actually agree with Chris on this one.
One thing that I'll just add that I can imagine someone saying in that position is to take the position that just deciding to die makes it the right decision in some way is to you have to give up saying that suicides are at least sometimes tragic, right? Well, if they chose to die, what's so tragic about it? They affirmed it themselves. So if you want to go that far, you can go that far, but I think a lot of people might balk at that. And even if you do this, you can have a bunch of different kinds of views about when suicide is and isn't permissible. You don't have, not going down this route doesn't mean you always think it's.
I'm sorry, but you guys said something else that's an important point. And for literally as long as people have talked about the issue of suicide, among the various reasons that people have given for thinking why it's wrong, some are the reasons that I've focused very much on about the value of human life. But the other very important reason historically is a concern about justice with regard to other people. And it is the case that especially when somebody without I think this is, it just is the case that when people commit suicide, many other people typically feel hurt, they feel abandoned, and that seems to me itself. Well, it is. I mean, if you think that human beings exist merely as isolated individuals, right, whose only connections to others are by way of their own decisions, right, then perhaps that will follow. But I don't think that that's the way in which people exist. If you think about the relationship of a child to his or her parents, right, children did not choose that relationship, but it's a real relationship. And it seems to me that it's a relationship that brings with it obligations and concerns that really need to be met. Children can go through a phase where they just don't care about their parents. Right? That doesn't make it the case that they have no obligations towards their parents, that they shouldn't be concerned about what their parents think or how their parents feel. And those are, I think, obligations of justice that all of us have to other people, even when we haven't chosen them.
All right, we started a couple minutes late, so we'll go a couple minutes late. We'll go one more question, and then if you still got thoughts, we will have a brief reception afterward.
My question is, where does compassion fall into this argument? Because sir, I disagree with you. I mean, as a family member who watched a family member in horrible, horrible pain and suffering. So please address the issue of human compassion toward a family, toward the individual.
So, again, there are, I think, increasingly differing understandings of what this word means. I think historically, the sense of compassion, and this is literally from its Latin roots, is it's a suffering with. Right? So that to engage compassionately with another is to take on their suffering with them. Right? That's different from a sense of compassion, understanding of compassion that moves towards ending the suffering by ending the life of the person who's suffering. Those are competing notions, right? They come with a wide set of competing views that back them up in various ways. So I think that the first one is the correct sense of compassion. Does that mean that physicians in suffering with their patients and accompanying them, family members in suffering with their patients and accompanying them through these horrible, very difficult times, shouldn't also try to relieve the suffering itself? Right? It seems to me that it doesn't follow that they shouldn't try to do that. Right? Part of the physician's job is to take care to relieve as much as possible the pain that the patient is in. So
what if they can't? What if they can't? What if it doesn't work anymore? What if the pain medicine does not work anymore, sir? Where's the compassion in that?
You have no right
Please address
to assume
this.
what that person feels. Like,
So-
the doctor can't put himself in that place.
Well,
The other person can. It's not possible.
So don't tell me about a compassionate family.
So what we'll do here, we'll let Chris say a little bit more, And then we'll stop. If you want to continue the conversation, there you can. Sure.
So there is,
You want to add something in there? So,
there is a large and important body of work on the extent to which pain medication, as physicians currently understand it, right, is capable of bringing patients to a relief from suffering. In some extreme cases, right, that requires bringing a patient to a state of unconsciousness. I think that's different from ending a patient's life. Right? I think there are circumstances in which palliative sedation to unconsciousness, even permanent unconsciousness, can be right. I take it that you disagree with that, but I think that this is not an uncompassionate way of addressing pain and suffering at the end of life.
Would you let Martin address the question as well?
I would.
Thank you.
Since we're running out of time, I'll be quick. I see compassion a bit differently in sort of its more modern sense. And I think that the physicians and family members, in being compassionate, need to help the person to achieve a kind of peace with his or her own values in the way that the person dies. And that can be the person taking account of you as well. As far as a physician feeling my suffering, I remember something from law school. It said when your client's problems become your problems and you feel your client's rage, you can then no longer function well. So I'd like my physician to be a bit cool and helpful and exercise compassion through helping me to achieve an end that fits with my values.
So I really think that it comes down to values that seem to be somewhat incommensurable. I mean, earlier, Chris referred to, putting a clown costume on someone who's unconscious. But I think that forcing someone who's unconscious to lie there and experience bed sores and whatever else might also harm the way they conceive of their dignity. I know it would mine. And just as a medical matter, I mean, there are studies out there on the issue, but I think it's completely there. I think it's just false as a matter of medicine to say that, this just happens in just a vanishingly small number of cases where someone should be rendered unconscious. But the other thing is that, I feel that, Justice Gorsuch was referenced earlier. I feel Justice Gorsuch would say, well, a patient gets a decision. Let's say that the patient says, I do not want a blood transfusion. Or I have other religious objections to certain kinds of treatment. I think that those would be respected. And so I just think that there is this, even though it might end that person's life. And so I just think that, different sides of the debate just recognize different kinds of autonomy, different ways to value life. And I don't know that there's a clear answer. This is very interesting.
Well, on that note, please thank the speakers. The session is back in. You'd like to stick around for a minute and chat. Thanks for coming up.